Hello, friends. Welcome to our weekly Data Talk, a show where we talk with data science leaders from around the world. Today, we're talking about using data to improve our classrooms. And very excited to talk to David Niemi. He's the VP of Measurement and Evaluation at Kaplan. And he has just written a new book about how data can be used to help learners and help teachers. And we'll talk about that book today and also get to know more about David and his work at Kaplan. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much. So happy to be here.
So David, can you share with us about your journey, about how you got involved in working in education and then helping now teachers and students learn better?
Sure. And it's really been, my whole career has been spent in education. Obviously, I was a student like all of us for many years. But by the time I got to college, I was just pretty unhappy at how I had been taught things and, started writing articles in the school paper.
So you're a troublemaker from the very beginning, David.
I really was, yeah. And I considered to be a troublemaker, yeah. And so I'd write papers about how badly some of the classes.
Oh my gosh! How are those received, David?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I would say the professors were actually much kinder and helpful, than they might have been. And they would recommend things. They said, well, there's a lot of interesting work going on at Berkeley about how we can improve teaching at the university level. And so I read some of that stuff. And then I became a teacher and ended up starting a couple of private elementary schools with parents who wanted sort of alternatives for their kids. I started a computer education company at the time when the first Apple computers came out.
Wow.
And it looked like there's some, possible interesting educational uses of them. And then eventually, I just got interested in knowing more about research on how technology could be used and how people learn and so on. So went back to graduate school, became a learning science researcher, then got interested in how we know whether people are learning. And that's kind of been the focus of my career ever since. I've worked, after being a university professor for a while, I've started to work with companies, just feeling well, the resources and chances to do things quickly are greater in this environment than they were at the university level. So that's how I got to where I am.
That's cool. So cool. So before we started this chat, we were talking about Kaplan. And I was saying how I know Kaplan from all the amazing books that they're producing to help students like pass tests and pass certain exams and also the learning centers around the country. But you're telling me that, can you tell me more about the work that Kaplan's doing?
Yeah, it's probably best known to most people, at least in this country, as a test prep company, and that's how it started. Was started by Stanley Kaplan many years ago. But we now have all kinds of different educational units and entities involved around the world. There are English language schools for students who want to improve their English from other countries and maybe go to universities in the U.S. or the UK. There are financial training, units of all different kinds around the world. And for a while, we had an online university, Kaplan University, which has now been sold to Purdue University. Which you might
have heard. Really?
Yeah. So it's now called Purdue Global, but we're still connected, and I'm still working with them. And also units like you had a previous interviewee, Debbie Barabiches from Metis, which is also a Kaplan unit. So a wide variety of different kinds of educational projects going on around the world. So, and I work with all those people on how we can make sure that we're using everything we know from learning science about how people learn and how to improve their learning, and also everything we know from measurement science about how to tell whether people are actually learning anything and who's learning what and what we can do about it.
So, Darren, I'm kind of curious, like when you first started working in your latest role, you have so much data that you can work with. What were some of the projects you wanted to tackle first, or what are some of the projects you're excited about working on right now?
Well, there's as you might guess, given all the different kinds of things that are going on Kaplan, there are a lot of different analytics projects going on, but the foundation for doing any of them well is to make sure that we have good measures of student learning. And, it's sort of like if you imagine we're all in Amazon and, our goal is to try to sell more products, but we don't have a good measure of whether we're selling anything and to whom we're selling it. That actually is a situation in education where the goal is to improve student learning, but across the board at all levels, we really, and this is not Kaplan I'm speaking about necessarily, but we really don't have good measures of learning. So that's kind of a first and basic thing that we're working on. How do we make sure that in every one of our units, if we're trying to teach students English, how are we measuring their improvements in learning skills? And then we can use that as sort of the foundation for analytics of everything else, all the other data we're collecting about students, to see what's working best for whom. But if you don't have that benchmark thing, everything else you're trying is just kind of like, you're throwing stuff at the wall without really understanding what the problem is, and without really having a valid idea whether you're improving learning or not. So that's kind of the first thing. And then we can do, and have started to do, a lot of different types of analytics to see, well, who's struggling and what are they struggling with? And then what do we know from either our data or other research on about what could help those particular kinds of students with those problems? So that's the area we've been moving into in the last few years, is because we have lots and lots of data, thousands of students studying in one course at one time, for example. Not as many as some of the huge MOOCs, which have hundreds of thousands of students in some cases, but up to tens of thousands. So very nice data sets where we're collecting lots of information about students as they move through the program. But so that's kind of been the sequence: making sure we're measuring learning effectively, and then looking at all the data we have to figure out who's struggling now, who's not making the progress they could, or who's even dropping out, and so on. And what can we find out about them before they start having problems, and or when they have problems? What can we do? How can we interact effectively? And that can involve trying different strategies, and then looking at the data from those tests of randomized controlled trials of different strategies to see, well, what's actually worked and for whom.
What sort of thinking about the online learner, where you're either able to gather a ton of data, how much time are they spending watching certain videos or doing certain types of completing online forms or questionnaires? What for online learners, what sort of data are you capturing, and how are you kind of using that to help improve and help save maybe the student who is starting to look like they're not interested anymore, or not logging in as much? Like how are you using that data and the insights to help then, okay, now what do you do to help save that student?
Well, there's a lot of different things to look at, and in different places we're trying to look at all of them. And so if you notice a student is not doing anything, for example, in an online course, there could be various causes for that. It could be something that has nothing to do with the program itself, something going on in their lives, some emergency, a financial crisis, they've lost their job or whatever. And we tend to have kind of older students than many universities, who, people who are working now, they have full-time jobs, they have families, and so on. So there can be lots of other things going on. So it's really critical, when you see that somebody is just not even getting started in the course, to connect immediately and find out what's going on. And some of that can happen online, just by sending messages to students and trying to get a response. If that doesn't work, you have to follow up with phone calls or whatever. But as students kind of move along through the program, they could be having, and this is the key thing for the analytics, to figure out what is it that's actually causing a student not to succeed, or be at risk of dropping out. Is it because they've got some outside problems that maybe we have to support them and help them with in some kind of an empathetic way, give them more time in the course or whatever? Is it some kind of a motivation problem where they're looking at the work and saying, wow, this is just too much, I can't handle this? So, many of us, when we see a situation like that, we just don't get started, we put off the task. So is it something like that? Is it a lack of good teaching before, prior knowledge that's necessary to deal with a certain course? So that could, that involves asking some questions, maybe giving little prior knowledge tests and so on to rule that out. Is it students just don't have good learning strategies? They don't know how to organize their time. So where the analytics helps out is by, through surveys or other information you have about students, making decisions about which one of those problems it is, because each one of them applies a different kind of solution. And some of the solutions could be delivered automatically online. So if you have a student saying something like, I don't know if I can handle this stuff, it just looks like a lot, you could show some little videos of students who've been in that exact same situation before and said, when I first looked at this, I just freaked out. I felt, I was about to give up, but here's what I did. I called the teacher, I talked on that. So, or motivational things like just hang in there, get started, it'll get better, and so on. So anyway, the main point is there can be a lot of different reasons that students have for not doing
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
And you got to figure out what through your analytics. And you could imagine if you were tracking students over several years, you could be collecting really great data over those years about, how to help students. And of course, this brings up privacy issues and other things. You have to do this in a way that, there's no risks to students of anything about them getting used, for any wrong purpose by anybody else. But that's another whole area of concern when we get into learning analytics, because the privacy issues are much more serious than when you're dealing with human learners than with people on Facebook or something like that.
Can you talk about how you're using machine learning to help improve the student's education?
Well, there haven't been a lot of great examples of that happening yet. I think the potential is there. Working with some really, really big kind of data sets. We've done some interesting things at Kaplan that are kind of simpler than machine learning, where you kind of look for clusters of similarities in students that will predict how they're going to do in the future. So we found some things, for example, that if you look at student behaviors, you can put students in about 5 different groups that significantly predict whether they're going to drop out of the course or not. And the lowest level group is just students who aren't doing anything. But if you can get those students to move up one level and do one thing, like participate in a discussion, do a quiz or something, that significantly enhances their chances of staying in the program. So we've been doing these kinds of analysis in manual ways, but this is where you could deploy, some machine learning strategies to kind of figure out as you go along, what are the features of students, given these huge data sets that we have over time, that most significantly predict, what's going to be happening, and how do we act to change those features. In the case of the behaviors I was talking about, it was, let's try to get them to do one more thing than they've been doing. And we know that will, from the data we have, that will significantly improve their performance. And we've also seen things like, there can be, what you want to do is kind of develop programs that can detect when there are specific assignments in a course that seem to be a stumbling block for a lot of students. And if you have students, for example, who are moving along successfully for a course, and then they encounter something and they just don't do it and they get a 0 on it, that kills their grade for the course. And some students will drop out because of that. So you want to be able to detect, things like that are causing some issue for a lot of students, and then, could be addressed, not necessarily, somebody's got to probably rewrite the task or do whatever to fix the curriculum. But right now we're just kind of in the preliminary stages of figuring out how to do those kinds of analyses and provide that information to course developers and other people to fix the issues.
Have you noticed any trends with the people that are doing? Hearing it echo myself. Are you seeing any trends with? I've been, I see these stats around people having less and less attention spans, and like statistics, like I think the last statistic I read was that the average attention span for a person is around 7 or 8 seconds, and it's like less than a goldfish. And there's all these like stats around there around people being more distracted nowadays with like iPhones and iPads, and sometimes people are using 2 to 3 devices at a time. And I'm wondering, have you noticed any patterns with people that are learning, specifically like online education, where attention spans are becoming less, or they need more or different types of media to keep them engaged? Have you noticed any patterns like that?
We haven't seen a pattern like that in what we've looked at so far, but you could imagine your system kind of watching for that and detecting, cases where students' attention is wandering or whatever, and you could actually do something about that. But it's a basic finding from, learning science that it's difficult for most people to like focus on reading a text for an hour straight without stopping to do anything else. So if you're going to design your instruction effectively, and this is one of the great things you could do in online courses, is actually, as I said, you could actually kind of monitor that and make suggestions like, maybe it's time to, take a little break here and answer some questions, do something else, whatever. But we haven't seen anything yet that would suggest, people can't pay attention for more than 5 to 7 seconds. There's ways to sort of focus that and, focus attention in in online programs. But it's a good question, because we've heard so much about this that I don't know. We don't have the data actually to support any conclusion about how long the basic attention span is. So at the moment, not something we're all that concerned about.
Cool. Do you see the usage of voice assistants being involved in education in the future?
Yeah, I think there are many good opportunities for that, because one of the issues with online learning, that we're maybe getting a little bit away from our analytics here, so we can come back to that. But analytics can play a role in this, because, and particularly AI implementations, students online tend to feel kind of isolated. They're not with students in person. And so they actually appreciate the contact with online teachers. But there have been some interesting examples of bots basically that have served as emotional and motivational supports for students. And these look very promising, actually. So you have someone talking to you basically, and if you could connect that to noticing when students seem to be having some trouble, and you bring in someone who asks them some questions about, gee, what's happening, and provide some support. The examples have shown that you can create automated, voice drivers like that people perceive as being a real person. Even if you tell them it's a robot, they still will interact and feel like it's the same as being a real person. In some cases, in one case, a professor created an automated teaching assistant who students thought was the best teaching assistant in the course. And that bot was just basically providing information about the course, when are the tests, and maybe some advice about when you should start studying and so on. So I think this is a very promising area, both for helping to provide some sort of empathetic support to students, but also just finding out what they think they're struggling with, and then responding to that.
Cool. So David, can you tell us about your new book? Why did you write it, and kind of an overview of what the book is about?
Well, it started as a Gates Foundation project to kind of build a framework for the somewhat new, it's a few years in the making now, the new field of learning analytics. And in that project, a bunch of experts in different areas of learning analytics, educators, learning science researchers, data mining specialists, and some people who have been looking into AI and all that, were brought together to kind of say, how do we build a framework that integrates all these kind of types of expertise, so that we can really move the field forward in a way that all these separate disciplines may not be able to do on their own. And that project eventually led to, I decided, I had written some stuff in connection with that work, decided I wanted to publish that, talked to some of the other people involved in the project, and they were really all up for putting together a book that would, in a sense, try to, figure out how should we develop a field that involves many different perspectives, instead of a bunch of different people working in their own silos, not communicating with each other. And that was really the purpose of the book. And I would say that, one of the big themes is the same one I was mentioning earlier. We got to start by knowing that we're focusing on learning, and we can measure learning effectively and so on. And then, what are all the things we can bring to bear on that particular goal?
And for those listening to the podcast, what is the title of the book when they're looking on Amazon?
It's called Learning Analytics in Education.
And who's like your target audience? Like, who would really benefit from reading this?
Well, it's really anybody who might be interested in topics like, somebody who may have heard about the field of learning analytics and might be interested in knowing something about what it's about, or that could be educators, for example, who would like to do more with the data they have and, operate more effectively, and want to know, so, gee, this new thing in learning analytics, could this help me? But it could also be people who are working in related areas, people working data mining, AI, machine learning, educational measurement experts, learning scientists. All those points of view are actually represented in the book. And I think the bringing together, of all these viewpoints could be useful to that wide audience of people.
And David, what would you suggest for the teacher in the classroom who wants to start using best practices, that wants to improve the learning environment, to be a better teacher, to help students that are struggling, but maybe they don't have backgrounds in data science?
Right.
but they do want to use like, well, I want to use like the best learnings from the stuff that you've learned, David, and I want to apply them in my classroom. What's your suggestion for them?
Yeah, well, obviously there are a lot of things I would recommend. And having been a classroom teacher myself, I have, some ideas about what would have helped me when I was trying to teach. And one of the things is I think we can help teachers by providing better assessments of student knowledge. At this point in my career, I've done a lot of work trying to train teachers to write better assessments of learning. And I'm now thinking it would actually be better if we could provide them with good assessments of each of the types of skills that teachers are supposed to be, or the students are supposed to be mastering, and help them become good users of assessment tools in kind of the same way that they now use instructional materials, the textbooks and so on. How do we help teachers become good users of textbook content and adapt it for their students and so on? So that's one key thing, providing them with more tools to measure learning, but also with more information about what to do when your students are struggling. Because a typical teacher is kind of, racing to get through the textbook. And if students don't master something in the textbook, there isn't really time to fix that. If you do that, then you're not going to get through the textbook. So we've kind of got to reshape that whole routine so that there is time to react to the data we have about students who are struggling and do something to help them. But that gets to the other important point, which is that teachers don't necessarily know, gee, I can do what's in the textbook, but if some students don't get it, I don't have 6 different ways to teach this content. So the information we provide them, if we're using, students are maybe doing assessments online and we're giving some results to teachers, that has to provide information about how to help the students, not just tell you who's not doing well.
Are there any favorite assessments out there, Dave, that you like, that you think provide good data to help with your analytics?
There aren't a lot of them. We've been building, some of them, and we're really interested in, providing good, complex performance kind of tasks that reflect what students will really need to be doing when they get out of school. Like they'll be able to write things, write a simple informational thing that tells somebody about something and does that effectively and clearly. So there are tasks like that around, and we've been building some and validating them and so on. But it would be a huge service to the world, actually, if someone started to just compile all of these things and make them available to people. And you want just, not some, you can go online and find all sorts of things that teachers and others have developed that are supposed to be good assessments, but no data have been collected about them. There's been no validation of them. And so we'd want to go through a lot of, trying out and testing of things before they're put into this database. But I really at this point can't say, well, if you want to effectively measure how your 3rd grade students are, go to this site. Do it. Actually, there's mostly junk stuff out there right now, unfortunately.
What since you have looked at so much data, what sort of data do you think is really missing? Like, if I had this data, we could greatly improve how we're teaching certain students.
Well, it's the kinds of data that I've been talking about in different ways and answer different questions here. One is we want to know, obviously you want to optimize learning for all students.
Yeah.
But in particular, you want to help the students who are really struggling. And so to do that, it's important to know what the source of those struggles is, or sources. And you want to differentiate among the kinds of things I was mentioning earlier. Is it a knowledge problem? They just don't know enough to tackle a particular course, so you need to give them a previous course, let's say. Is it a motivation problem? Is it using bad strategies, not knowing how to learn effectively? Or is it something else? And for most students, we don't have any of those kinds of data. So you could say it's really wide open, what the field can do, to kind of revolutionize what's going on in education is to make available to everybody. And we have lots of instruments from research and psychology about how to measure, just quick little survey things. You can ask students 2 or 3 questions that would tell you, they're not even going to try this because they're so unmotivated to do this, and they're so fearful that they can do it, and maybe they don't believe it's worth doing, and a variety of other things. So it's a lot of different things we need to start collecting information on. And that can sound overwhelming, but we've gotten started and actually made quite a bit of progress, which at Kaplan, which I'd say could be an encouragement to other people to be beginning to do some of the same kinds of things.
Do you have any favorite examples or case studies of how data has been pulled in by you, Kaplan, to help improve workbooks or curriculum, to help teachers?
Definitely, I can give you a couple of examples. And some of them are just probably obvious common sense things, but the research has repeatedly demonstrated them. So one simple thing is, if you're showing diagrams to people, put the labels of the parts of the diagram next to those parts. Don't put them along the edges of the page and create arrows and all this. So that's just sort of good visual design. But it's amazing how many textbooks you can look at to see that that's violated. And the research shows that impairs students' learning if you don't do that correctly.
Oh.
And then people are widely overusing graphics that they think are fun or motivational to students. If you look at a third grade math textbooks, it's filled with more little pictures of flowers and cute animals and other stuff like that. There's more of that than actual math content in there. And the research suggests that actually is distracting and impairs students' learning. It's not helping at all. I mean, all of us could learn from this when we make PowerPoints too, because people like to put little pictures that have nothing to do with the point we're trying to make, but we think, oh, well, people will get motivated to read this. And the research says the opposite of that. So that's a big thing.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then things like, typically we don't give students enough practice at things. We tell them how to do something. Like in college courses, you don't get any practice on how to do anything. You just write papers and have tests, but you don't have any practice on how to write good papers. You have to kind of figure that out on your own. So that's another big thing that we build in our curriculum is you do some initial instruction on how to do something, what it is we expect you to be able to do, but then you should get some practice and feedback before you have to do it for real and actually get graded on it. So that's a few examples of how we're applying learning science.
That's awesome. Before we go, I would love if you can maybe share your new book that just came out. How did you break up the book? How is it divided up for the person who is interested in getting a copy?
Sorry, you mean
as far as like I'm like if I were to look at the outline of the book and how it's structured, what are some of the topics you cover?
Well, there's kind of an interesting theoretical piece that's really talking about the digital ocean and how we can think about dealing with all the kind of overwhelming amount of data we have in education now, which is a big change over the last 10 years or so, where it was actually hard to get data and there wasn't much of it. If you wanted to do a study of student learning and you wanted to see how students are doing, you'd have to go into the principal's office and pull file folders and manually enter data for each one of the students. And so we moved from that state to the situation where there's almost too much data and there's no way you can expect an educator to do anything with it. So one of the chapters provides a framework for, so how do we think about tackling this problem? How do we organize the data and make it useful and so on? I happen to have written a chapter on using data to improve academic persistence. And that I've touched on a few of the points from that chapter before. How do we help students just stick with it on various levels, not just get them motivated to, go to college or whatever, but help them with the day-to-day tasks that you have to kind of get through to get there. And there's some other really interesting chapters on some policy and privacy issues for students too, because as some of us know, there are federal laws protecting the privacy of information about students. So it's much more serious to pay attention to those issues too. And then there are, some things about, how do we look at computer programs students are creating and evaluate, and respond to those online? How do we look at artifacts that students have created? Could be textual artifacts or whatever else, and how can we build automated, programs to evaluate and give feedback to students on those? So might give you a sense of a range of topics. And of course, anyone can go on Amazon and look at the table of contents, the first page thing, and even read a few pages.
Awesome. And what I'll do is, for those listening to the podcast, I created a short URL redirect that'll bring you right over to the Amazon page where you can buy the book. The short URL is just ex.pn/David book, and that'll bring you right over to David's page on Amazon, so you can check out the book, get a copy, or get the ebook version. It sounds like a wonderful read, and I hope I'm going to actually get it in the mail very, very soon. I can't wait to go through it. David, thank you so much for being our guest in Data Talk. Thank you for sharing the work that you're doing to help improve the classroom, helping both teachers and students. And thank you for just doing all that, and thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I hope we've inspired some data science people to get involved in education. And we need everybody.
That's awesome. Awesome. And David, where can people get in touch with you if they want to contact you, especially the data scientists there listening in?
I'll give you an email here. It's just dniemi@kaplan.edu.
Okay, great. And so I'll just spell that out for those listening. It's DNIEMI@kaplan.edu. So get in touch with David. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.